Hey everyone, Tactics here, and today I wanted to talk about a topic that I've seen a lot of discussion on since the most recent patch, and that's augmentation evokers, how they've impacted mainly Mythic Plus, the formation of that Exodia god comp, and what all this means for the future of Mythic Plus in WoW. It's a big topic, of course, so I'll try to keep it as brief as I can, meaning I will be ignoring the raid aspect of augmentation, but maybe that is something that we can revisit once we've seen how they've kind of impacted the meta in 10.2's raid. Now, to kind of lay the groundwork a bit for anyone who's not totally familiar, the augmentation evoker spec was introduced in patch 10.1.5 as a DPS spec that functioned more like a support. So they have things like primary stat buffs and crit amps to other players that represented the majority of their damage, with a small amount being their personal actual damage that they outputted, as well as unique utility tools such as like a 100-yard teleport with Wurnstone. Interesting stuff for sure, but with the release of the patch, extremely quickly we saw the rise of this Exodia comp in Mythic Plus, which consisted of Augmentation Evoker, Fire Mage, Shadow Priest, Holy Paladin, and Guardian Druid. Three of these specs also received some sort of rework with the patch that gave them a solid throughput boost, and then there was also Shadow, which was kind of the one staple meta DPS spec in Season 2 that existed prior to that patch, largely due to dungeon design. That's kind of a separate from the whole augmentation issue, but I'll briefly touch on that as well. Why was Shadow Priest so good? And I think this is the kind of rare case where particularly two parts of their utility kit were very, very powerful in Mass Dispel and Mind Soothe, as they were extremely important to your success across multiple dungeons in the pool. Not every dungeon, but enough that you just generally wanted to run a Shadow Priest. For Mind Soothe, this is mostly due to a large number of humanoid and dragonkin mobs that were both dangerous to fight, and in some cases also had true sight, so you couldn't even skip them via things like Shroud or Invispot. You had to have a priest. For Mass Dispel, it's the existence of many bosses and even trash pulls, again across multiple different dungeons in the pool, that put out magic debuffs that are dangerous on more than one target. Think first boss in Halls of Infusion, as well as those dragons later in the dungeon. Again, those mobs had true sight. Think Emberon and the last boss in Alderman, the charging mobs at the beginning of Vortex Pinnacle. There's just a lot this season. The solution here, I think, is a combination of reducing true sight on mobs, tuning these actual mobs so that their abilities are less dangerous, so you don't feel as punished if you don't have a priest to dispel their abilities, or you don't have a priest to soothe them, so you have to fight them, and just in general, making sure a dungeon pool of 8 or however many dungeons doesn't have as many of these instances like we see in Season 2. Another side thing for Shadow Priest potentially is making PI self-cast only, and then making twins only available to healer priests to kind of make the divide between bringing a Shadow Priest who essentially gives you an extra PI on a DPSer versus a healer priest which only gives you one PI on a DPSer, kind of easier to balance. Would make Shadow in general easier to balance, but maybe that's a discussion for another video. Now back to the Exodia comp. This combination of specs, again, was so powerful that literally overnight, going into 10.1.5, we saw the max key level players were able to actually complete jump up like 3 to 4, which is kind of unheard of for a mid-season adjustment. This, of course, had a lot of players, rightfully, pretty upset. For players pushing for the 0.1% Mythic Plus title, they felt that all of their work pushing keys up until that patch was basically meaningless, and for your average player just kind of pugging in the group finder, because of that kind of trickle down, we must play the meta even when it's not required kind of mentality, it became exceptionally hard to get invites to groups if you weren't one of those 5 Exodia specs, and it might actually be the hardest season to ever pug in if you're not playing a meta spec. This was especially shocking because up until 10.1.5, Dragonflight had actually an extremely diverse meta, particularly back in Season 1, where if you look at the front page of like Raider.io or something like that, you'll see, 2 different tank specs, I think 3 or 4 different healer specs, and then a bunch of different DPS comps represented running the highest keys possible. So the question is, how did this happen? And what can actually be done to stop the sort of stagnant meta from happening again in future seasons? The big elephant in the room is, of course, Augmentation Evoker, but what exactly about them is so powerful in the current state of Mythic Plus. I think the big one here is their primary stat boost in Ebonmite, as well as, of course, their 2-minute CD that they brew out with their breath, which will interact well with PI from the Shadow Priest, and that's kind of why you want some spec in that third slot, which in this case is Fire Mage, but could be some other things, just depending on what's tuned the best, that can kind of make use of that 2-minute breath and PI window. But talking about Ebonmite, their primary stat boost, this will always buff your entire party in Mythic Plus content. So that's your 2 other DPSers, as well as your tank and your healer. From a damage perspective, if you assume that, you're playing in a top end group or whatever, that's going to reroll, swap to whatever's meta and whatever's good that patch, that kind of means that you're always going to be buffing 2 of the best DPS specs available, which likely means that the damage contribution of Augmentation, assuming it's balanced like a DPS spec, is also going to be near the top end when you're doing that. Now, of course, Augmentation was certainly overtuned at release. It's been nerfed a couple times, and obviously there's the case where it is extremely undertuned and it's just so bad that you never play it. But I think because this spec does so little personal damage and so much of its damage is coming from buffs, it has a bigger safety net for it to be a competitive DPS spec, because they can just buff whatever is meta that patch. Whatever is good that patch, they can put their buffs into them and let them carry their damage. Not to mention they're also buffing the damage of your tanks and your healers. Speaking of tanks and healers, this primary stat buff does more than just give them damage, right? It also buffs their personal throughput. This has been particularly impactful for tanks when combined with that blistering scales buff, increasing baseline durability, active mitigation strength, and threat across the board for tanks, which has been exceptionally good for some more off-meta picks like Brewmaster and Blood DK, but again, beneficial to all tank specs and is something literally no other DPS spec does. So Augmentation is always buffing the best DPS in the game in Mythic Plus. They give your healer more throughput, and they make your tank tankier. If that's not enough, they also have those extra bits of utility that I previously mentioned that are entirely unique to them. But I think that's a bit more of a slippery slope argument, since you can always kind of rattle off a massive list of utility spells to say, oh, this spec has X, Y, Z, and that makes them OP. And you can make them sound OP if you just do a giant list, right? But instead, I want to actually focus on what I think is the bigger problem that Augmentation has that no other DPS in the game has, and that is the multitude of party-wide defensive boosts. While some specs have raid cooldowns like AMZ or Rally and Cry, I think what Augmentation specifically has goes well beyond those individual buttons that have relatively long CDs. Zephyr, of course, is kind of the direct comparison to the ones I just listed, which is available to every evoker on a 2-minute CD. But then if you look at Augmentation specifically, they also have Chrono Ward, right? That gives you a shield based on damage done during the evoker's breath window, essentially providing a 30% health buffer against potential big hits. The other one that's big is their Black Attunement, which passively is 4% max health on your entire party, but then that jumps to 10% max health for 12 seconds when they use their Obsidian Scales Personal, which they have 2 charges of on a 1.5-minute CD. So they basically have 4 different party defensives they can use, all of which have a CD of 2 minutes or less, and with current dungeon design, the gate for pushing keys has been survivability, right? Not damage. So having a spec that can basically apply some sort of mitigation on your entire party for most, if not all, major instances of damage is just insanely powerful, and a huge reason for the massive overnight key level bump that we talked about. That's not even bringing up the fact that their mastery also applies a substantial versatility buff to players as well, so there's even more defensive power there that we're not talking about. I think overall, the problem here is kind of twofold. First, dungeon design, as I mentioned, is such that overall damage is kind of second to survivability. So if one spec has competitive damage and is the only thing that has multiple party-wide externals, it's going to be meta. It's going to be a staple. Second, in my opinion, Augmentation is having a bit of an identity crisis. Blizzard is really pushing this as a DPS spec, meaning they feel the need to make its damage competitive with other DPS specs. However, the problem then becomes they're kind of overloaded with those support-like defensive abilities I just mentioned, so now they're just bringing more than other DPS specs. As an example, let's compare them to their sister spec, Devastation, who has all the same class utility, but is lacking the Augmentation-specific stuff. So if both of them are outputting similar numbers in 5-man content, why would you ever take Devastation, right? Augmentation has more stops, they have more off-healing, they have more health, they give you more speed, they make your tank more durable, right? They just do more than just damage, even compared to a spec of the same class, which kind of brings me to my point. Augmentation is not a DPS spec. As much as they want to make it one, it just isn't. It's something else entirely. It's a support spec. And the issue is that there's literally zero competition in that space. It's the first of its kind, and nothing else can do the same things it does, and as we're seeing, that's causing some growing pains. And don't get me wrong here, I actually really like the idea of support specs in WoW, but having one single spec in the game that functions that way is going to cause some issues. So how do we solve them? I think there's a few options here, with the first having nothing to do with augmentation itself. Instead, dungeon designs, and in particular, damage tuning in dungeons. Mythic Plus is infinitely scaling content. You will always hit some sort of wall. However, what wall you hit is the question here. Before augmentation was added, the Season 2 wall was survivability. We were hitting the X abilities going to one-shot you with no defensive upstage across the board in every dungeon. If that's the wall you're hitting, then obviously a spec that gives you a ton of party defensive options is going to be very, very good, even if it isn't the highest damage option, because damage output isn't what's walling you. If instead the wall is not you constantly getting one shot, but you actually being able to kill everything within the timer of a dungeon, then all of a sudden that opens up the door to specs that maybe provide less to your group defensively, but have more offensive upside, right? Now this alone may not stop augmentation from continuing to dominate the meta due to them being tuned like a DPS spec, which basically brings me to another potential solution. Don't tune them like a DPS spec. As we've discussed, this is something entirely different, and I think a fair downside to a spec that is overloaded with group utility and defensive cooldowns is to make them deal a bit less damage than a regular DPS spec. What exactly that number is, I'm not sure. Is it 90% of a DPSer? Is it 80% of a DPSer? I think that's something that Blizzard kind of needs to decide. But from an outside perspective, as someone who doesn't play DPS, right, I'm a tank player, it definitely feels a bit unfair that they can out DPS someone like Devastation Evokers, someone like Hunter specs, right, as an example, who just bring way less to the table outside of pure damage. Another comment I've heard is to actually adjust the damage output of the spec such that it's more into personal damage than buff damage, and then you tune down their defensive utility a bit, doing things like making them unable to buff tanks and healers, for example. Personally, I think this is my least favorite approach to fixing this issue. As I've said, I do kind of like the idea of support specs, and this basically eliminates that identity. There's certainly some aspects that could be taken down a notch, like their mastery that I mentioned, giving verse. Probably can change that to be just like flat damage, right? Overall, support specs are a cool idea though, and I actually want to see more of it, not less, which leads to probably the longest term solution I have, and that's adding more support specs. This is obviously unlikely to happen before the next expansion, so we're looking at an 11.0 solution here, but I think creating more specs to compete in that same support space as augmentation and kind of acknowledging that the role of support is here and it's different than DPS is probably my favorite option. There's plenty of cool spec ideas out there. You know, there's Bard as a classic for rogues, maybe the return of like a gladiator type spec for warriors based on the warlord class from Dungeons and Dragons with like shouts and banners, maybe a third spec for demon hunters that like uses bows and buffs people with fell energy. The list goes on. There's so many out there. You could have these specs kind of follow a similar damage profile as augmentation, where a lot of their damage comes from buffs and a small amount is personal damage, and that would kind of contain them so you wouldn't be like stacking them in dungeon content, right? You'd only want one really in your Mythic Plus group if they're not providing a lot of damage on their own, as an example, and then that leaves you open to kind of differentiate how these different support specs kind of buff players. Aug right now, like I mentioned, has that 2-minute burst CD, which, you know, is combining with PI right now, and that makes you really want to have a third DPS that can take advantage of that 2-minute window. But what if now you have a support spec that has like a 1-minute intervals or 3-minute intervals, or just is consistent, right? That potentially allows those different support specs to synergize with different DPS specs and kind of have variable CD timings along with that. Of course, this option does mean that we are stuck with augmentation dominance likely until we actually get more support specs in like an 11.0 or beyond kind of space. Personally, I'd be okay with that, but I know a lot of people are not happy with that. So I'd love to hear what you guys think down in the comments below. What do you think the best solution is? What kind of support specs would you want to see? Is augmentation in its current state even a problem? Let me know down below. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like it. Shout out to all of my supporters over on Patreon. You guys continue to help me do what I do, so thank you. And thank you everyone watching right now. I'll see you all in the next video.